November 20th, 1943. The sun had barely risen over the tiny speck of coral in the central Pacific, known as Betio, part of the Tarawa atoll. What should have been a postcard of turquoise waters and white beaches was instead transformed into a nightmare of smoke, fire, and blood. The tide lay low, revealing jagged reefs that trapped landing craft hundreds of yards from shore. Waves of American Marines, weighed down with gear, waded chest-deep through surf under a rain of Japanese bullets and mortar fire. The sea itself turned crimson, yet through the chaos, one thing stood out to the Japanese defenders perched in their bunkers and pillboxes. The Americans never stopped coming. They were cut down by the hundreds, sprawled lifeless across the reef and the sands, but fresh waves pressed forward. The defenders, veterans of a garrison sworn to fight to the death, could not comprehend the sheer relentlessness. To them, no soldier should willingly march into certain death. And yet these Marines did, hour after hour, yard by yard. The Japanese had prepared Betio to be impregnable. More than 4,500 elite troops of the Imperial Navy's Special Naval Landing Forces, commanded by Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, waited behind miles of interlocked trenches, fortified bunkers, and massive steel-reinforced pillboxes. Heavy machine guns peeked from firing slits no wider than a palm, overlapping in deadly crossfire. Mortars were pre-sighted. Artillery zeroed in on the beaches. The Admiral himself had boasted, "1 million men cannot take Tarawa in 100 years." He believed it because he knew how his defenses had been designed. Every inch of the island had been prepared to bleed an enemy dry. From their perspective, the Americans would never dare charge such a fortress head-on. But as the first landing craft approached, Shibasaki's men saw something they had not expected. Even when boats were shredded by artillery, even when men were thrown screaming into the water, the formations did not scatter in panic. They reorganized. Marines leapt over floating corpses to push forward. Officers shouted commands through the din, rallying men behind tanks that crawled slowly over the reef. When one squad was annihilated, another took its place. To the Japanese, who had been trained to value death above surrender, the sight of an enemy so unwilling to retreat was staggering. The battle was a study in brutality. Marines stormed across open sand with no cover, but the bodies of the fallen, tossing grenades into pillboxes, firing flamethrowers into dark concrete caverns. Japanese defenders, hidden deep in bunkers, unleashed bursts that shredded flesh, then fell silent, waiting for Marines to come closer before erupting again. Each yard gained was paid in blood. And yet, the Americans would not stop. Time and again, the Japanese soldiers peered through their firing slits, expecting to see hesitation, fear, or withdrawal. Instead, they saw waves of determined faces, mouths set in grim resolve. The sheer noise was overwhelming. Naval bombardments had thundered for hours before the landing, but much of the Japanese defense remained intact. As Marines hit the beach, the sky roared again with the scream of dive bombers and the thunder of naval guns firing inland. Explosions sent fountains of coral, sand, and bodies into the air. Smoke clung low, choking the battlefield in a haze. Still, Marines advanced. Their voices, hoarse from saltwater and shouting, cut through the smoke. "Move up! Cover left! Take that bunker!" To the Japanese, this sounded alien. An enemy that did not break. An enemy that did not falter. For the Americans, it was not courage without fear, but courage despite it. Many were just teenagers, farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, students from New York. They had been hardened by months of training, but nothing could prepare them for Betio. And yet, when their comrades fell beside them, they carried on. A man would grab the rifle of his dying friend and keep pushing forward. Another would drag a wounded Marine to cover, then sprint into open fire to join the next charge. These acts, repeated thousands of times, created an unstoppable tide. The Japanese tried counterattacks in the first night, rushing forward in desperate banzai charges. They screamed and lunged with bayonets, expecting shock and terror to scatter the Americans. But the Marines held their lines, firing in disciplined volleys, mowing down wave after wave. Japanese officers realized in horror the Americans would not break, not even under their most ferocious attacks. The doctrine that had broken Chinese divisions and stunned British garrisons in the early years of the war failed here. Against the Marines at Tarawa, the suicidal charge was not met with fear. but with iron resolve and cold, relentless firepower. By the second day, Japanese defenders whispered to one another inside their bunkers. Some wondered if these Americans were even human. How could they walk into such slaughter again and again? Their own creed had taught them that death was honorable, that no soldier should endure such punishment and continue fighting. But the Marines embodied something different: the refusal to give ground, the will to keep moving forward no matter the cost. In those moments, Japanese soldiers faced not just a military foe but a psychological shock. They had underestimated the American spirit. The island itself became a graveyard. Palm trees shattered into splinters, the lagoon choked with wreckage, the air fouled by smoke and decay. Still, Marines raised their flags and signaled reinforcements. Their commanders, standing waist-deep in water under fire, refused to retreat. Radio operators worked with shells bursting around them, calling in naval guns that pulverized Japanese strongholds. Engineers crawled forward with explosives, blowing open bunker doors so flamethrower teams could finish the job. Step by step, the Americans turned Shibasaki's boast into a lie. By the third day, the Japanese garrison was crumbling. Most fought to the death, refusing surrender, but even in their final hours they could not shake the disbelief. They had expected fear. Instead, they had found a wall of steel. Their bullets tore into flesh, but the enemy kept advancing. Their artillery thundered, but Marines rose from the smoke. Even as their island fortress collapsed, they struggled to comprehend. How could these men endure so much and never turn back? Tarawa was not just a battle of guns and fortifications. It was a collision of wills. For the Japanese defenders, the sight of American Marines never backing down was as shocking as any weapon. And for the Americans, the victory came not through superior numbers alone, but through an iron determination that refused to yield. Tarawa became the first true test of amphibious assault against a fortified island in the Pacific War, and it showed the world something that would echo across the Pacific. The Marines would pay in blood, but they would never break. By late 1943, the world stood at a turning point. The Axis war machine, once unstoppable, was beginning to feel the weight of Allied power. In Europe, the Soviet Union bled the Wehrmacht dry at Kursk and Stalingrad. In the Mediterranean, Italy had already fallen, forcing Germany to stretch its lines thinner than ever. But in the Pacific, the story was different. There, the Japanese still held vast territories, from the jungles of Burma to the far reaches of the Solomon Islands. The empire had spread across ocean and island, a web of strongholds fortified against any assault. Among them, the Gilbert Islands became the first domino the United States targeted in its new island-hopping strategy. The decision to strike Tarawa was not made lightly. American planners knew the island was more than a coral speck. It was a fortress guarding the path to the Marshall Islands, then to the Marianas, and eventually to Japan itself. If the Marines could crack this stronghold, it would prove the feasibility of amphibious warfare against entrenched defenders. If they failed, the Pacific campaign might stall indefinitely. Tarawa was, in effect, a test by fire. At this stage of the war, Japanese forces still held a reputation for ferocity and invincibility. Their early conquests had humiliated Western powers. At Singapore, a British garrison twice their size had surrendered in shame. In the Philippines, American and Filipino troops had endured the brutal Bataan Death March. Across Asia, the rising sun seemed unstoppable. Their doctrine was built not only on firepower, but on psychology. The belief that Japanese soldiers indoctrinated to fight to the death could break the spirit of any opponent. On Betio, Rear Admiral Shibasaki intended to prove this once again. American intelligence underestimated the challenge. Maps of Betio were incomplete, aerial photographs misleading. Planners believed that naval and aerial bombardment would crush the defenses before the Marines landed. But the Japanese had designed their bunkers to withstand just such an assault. Concrete reinforced with steel, sand piled thick on top, gun ports barely wide enough to fire through. Even when shells struck directly, most fortifications remained intact. What the Americans believed would be a storming of ruins instead became a march into the jaws of hell. Doctrines on both sides clashed head-on at Tarawa. The Japanese believed in static, heavily fortified defense. Shibasaki's men were ordered to die where they stood, buying time with their blood. They had prepared interlocking fields of fire, machine guns placed to rake every yard of sand. Mortars were pre-ranged on the lagoon, turning the shallow waters into killing grounds. They believed no enemy could withstand such punishment. The Americans, on the other hand, had embraced mobility and relentless assault. The Marine Corps, forged in the crucible of Guadalcanal, had learned the brutal cost of hesitation. They would meet the Japanese creed of death with their own creed of determination. For them, retreat was not an option. If they could seize Betio, the path across the Pacific would be open. If they failed, every island assault to come would be cast into doubt. The larger strategic situation magnified Tarawa's importance. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, sought to leapfrog across Japanese strongholds, seizing only those islands that provided airstrips or anchorages. The Gilbert Islands were the first step. From there, American bombers could strike deeper into Japanese territory, and the lessons learned would guide the next assaults: Kwajalein, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Tarawa was the proving ground. On the Japanese side, Tarawa symbolized defiance. The empire's propaganda machine had declared the island impregnable. Shibasaki's boast that 1,000,000 men could not take Tarawa in 100 years was repeated endlessly in Tokyo. Japanese soldiers were told they were the guardians of the empire's outer wall, warriors destined to hold back the American tide. To surrender was dishonor, to retreat unthinkable. The garrison knew they would not leave the island alive. This clash of expectations shaped the first hours of battle. When the naval bombardment ended, Japanese soldiers emerged from their bunkers shocked but alive, ready to unleash hell. When the Marines came through the surf, they were stunned not by the firepower but by the enemy's refusal to turn back. On both sides, doctrines collided violently. One side preaching death before surrender, the other demonstrating that determination could carry men through fire itself. For the Americans, the shock of Tarawa was twofold. First, they realized their bombardment had been woefully insufficient. Second, they understood that the Japanese were not like the Germans or Italians. They would not surrender en masse, nor flee when outnumbered. They would fight to the last man, dragging the enemy into the bloodiest combat imaginable. For many Marines, the first hours on Betio were their initiation into a new kind of war, one that would define the Pacific theater. The Japanese, too, experienced a shock. For years, their propaganda had painted Americans as soft, unwilling to suffer, incapable of matching Japanese resolve. But on Betio, they watched men wade through chest-high water under machine gun fire, crawl across beaches littered with corpses, and storm bunkers with grenades and flamethrowers. They saw boys from farms and factories show the same suicidal determination they had believed was uniquely Japanese. This realization unsettled them more than the shells and bombs. Tarawa was in many ways a crucible of modern war. It represented the shift from sweeping conquests to grinding attrition. For the Japanese, it marked the beginning of the empire's slow, bloody retreat. For the Americans, it was the first taste of what lay ahead. A long campaign where every mile of coral, jungle, and volcanic ash would be paid for with lives. Tarawa became not just a battle, but a symbol, a warning that in the Pacific, there would be no easy victories. In November 1943, as the smoke settled each night over Betio, both sides began to understand the stakes. For the Marines, failure meant dishonor and delay. A Pacific campaign stalled before it truly began. For the Japanese, defeat meant the empire's outer walls crumbling. For both, the island became a microcosm of the wider war, a brutal struggle where courage, doctrine, and will collided on a scale too small for maps to capture, but large enough to shape the course of history. The defenders of Betio believed they knew their enemy. They had been told the Americans were weak, lacking the spiritual core that defined the Japanese soldier. They had seen British forces surrender in Singapore, watched as Western armies crumbled under surprise assaults. But on Tarawa, as the smoke of naval bombardment cleared and the Americans began their push inland, the Japanese realized something far more troubling. The Marines possessed a hidden advantage, not in numbers, not in sheer bravery, but in their ability to coordinate under fire. Even as chaos tore apart the beaches, American units reformed, shifted, and pressed forward with uncanny cohesion. The secret lay in something the Japanese had not fully grasped: technology, training, and a doctrine of relentless adaptation. At the heart of this advantage was communication. The Marines storming Betio were not isolated individuals. They were connected through a web of radios, that allowed squads, platoons, tanks, and naval gunners to act as one. Amid the thunder of artillery and the crack of machine guns, voices crackled over the airwaves. Forward observers, crouched behind palm stumps or the wreckage of Higgins boats, directed naval fire onto strong points with precision. Tank commanders coordinated with infantry, pivoting their armor to blast pillboxes at the exact moment flamethrower teams rushed forward. Mortars adjusted instantly, responding to shouted corrections passed through radio nets. The Japanese defenders, by contrast, relied on runners, hand signals, and pre-planned fire zones. Their communication lines were fragile, cut as soon as a bunker collapsed or a runner was shot down. In theory, their interlocking defense should have created a perfect killing field. But in practice, once gaps appeared, they struggled to adapt. Pillboxes that were bypassed could not call reinforcements. Mortars fired blindly, hoping to hit advancing Marines but often wasting shells. Their doctrine assumed the enemy would break under the first storm of fire. When the Americans did not, the Japanese had little flexibility left. Another hidden advantage lay in American amphibious doctrine. The Marines had learned from Guadalcanal that hesitation killed. On Tarawa, even when landing craft were trapped on reefs, Marines improvised, jumping into the surf and pushing forward. Small units acted independently, pressing attacks without waiting for higher orders. This decentralization baffled the Japanese. They were accustomed to enemies freezing when officers fell. But on Betio, corporals and sergeants led men forward, calling in fire support with handheld radios, keeping momentum alive. Where one attack stalled, another surged, hammering the defenders from new angles. American technology magnified this flexibility. The Japanese had expected the naval bombardment to cripple the invasion, but when their bunkers held, they believed they had the upper hand. Then came the M4 Sherman tanks, lumbering ashore from landing craft, some stalling on reefs, others plunging forward into the surf. With names like China Gal and Cecilia, these machines crawled onto the beaches, shrugging off small arms fire and blasting fortifications point blank. The Japanese were stunned. They had fortified against infantry, expecting to mow men down by the hundreds. Against armored steel, their defenses were suddenly vulnerable. Where Japanese defenders saw chaos, the Americans built order. Flamethrowers roared into pillbox slits, grenades arced through openings, demolition charges thundered against bunker doors. But none of this happened in isolation. Marines timed their assaults with covering fire, coordinated through radios and hand signals, moving like parts of a larger machine. Each attack, small in scale, added up to a relentless tide. The defenders were witnessing something they had not accounted for, the fusion of technology, doctrine, and willpower into a form of warfare that could not be broken by static defenses alone. The Japanese soldiers inside their bunkers began to whisper disbelief. They had been told the Americans were soft, that one hard blow would scatter them. Yet these men waded into fire, reorganized under bombardment, and pushed forward as if guided by an invisible hand. When a squad fell, another filled the gap. When tanks were lost, infantry compensated. When obstacles blocked the beach, engineers crawled forward with explosives. To the defenders, it felt less like fighting individual soldiers and more like facing an unstoppable organism, one that absorbed losses and adapted in real time. Morale began to waver in unexpected ways. Japanese commanders shouted for their men to hold, to remember the emperor, to die where they stood. But as they watched the Americans, doubt crept in. These Marines did not fight like the colonial troops they had defeated in Asia. They fought with discipline, ferocity, and an unnerving refusal to yield. Some defenders began to wonder if the emperor's words about the enemy's weakness were lies. Others clung to their orders, preparing to sell their lives dearly. Yet all of them felt the same shock. The Americans should have broken, and they had not. The hidden advantage was not just material, it was psychological. American Marines did not rely on mystical devotion or promises of honor in death. Their strength came from each other, from the belief that the man beside them would not falter. Radios carried commands, but courage carried actions. Japanese defenders, who had been trained to fight in isolation if cut off, could not understand this bond. To them, dying alone in a bunker was honorable. To the Marines, survival depended on cohesion, on moving as one body. That cohesion, visible in every charge, unnerved the defenders more than any shell or flame. The longer the battle dragged on, the more the Japanese realized the Americans' hidden edge was not just technology or doctrine, but resilience itself. The Marines absorbed punishment that should have shattered them, and still they came. They turned every setback into a lesson, every loss into momentum. Shibasaki's men began to feel a creeping dread. They were not just facing soldiers, they were facing a nation's determination, delivered in flesh and steel onto their tiny island. And as night fell on the second day, with Marines digging in on ground that had been declared untouchable, the truth became undeniable. The Americans' hidden advantage had been revealed not through boast or proclamation, but through action. The Japanese could not understand how men so young, so far from home, could fight with such endurance. But they would learn, in the coming days, that this advantage, by the fusion of will, coordination, and technology, would not only take Tarawa, but would echo across the Pacific island by island, until the rising sun itself began to set. The roar of battle at Tarawa could be heard for miles, but beneath the chaos of gunfire and screaming men lay the quieter hum of machinery and invention. War is not only won by courage, it is shaped by wires, steel, and the minds of engineers who design tools that bend the course of history. At Betio, the Americans' hidden edge came alive not only through willpower, but through technology that gave form and strength to that will. Radios, tanks, landing craft, flamethrowers, each piece seemingly small, combined to create a force the Japanese had not anticipated. Take the radio. To the untrained eye, it was just a metal box strapped to the back of a marine radio man wading through surf. To the Japanese, it was invisible. Its power only felt when their bunkers came under sudden, precise bombardment. The SCR-300, a backpack model introduced just months earlier, weighed nearly 35 pounds and could reach up to 5 miles over rough terrain. On Betio, where the island was less than 3 miles across, that range meant near-total battlefield coverage. The larger SCR-508 and SCR-528, mounted in tanks and command vehicles, carried communications further, linking squads on the beach with offshore naval fire control. German and Japanese radios of the era relied on amplitude modulation, which crackled with static, drowned out by interference. American sets used frequency modulation, producing clear signals even under fire. This meant a Marine squad pinned behind a seawall could call for mortars, or a forward observer could direct a destroyer's guns onto a bunker without delay. Each strike seemed uncanny to the Japanese, who could not grasp how their enemy adjusted so swiftly. They did not realize they were witnessing the silent work of circuits, vacuum tubes, and engineers who had transformed theory into battlefield supremacy. Equally critical were the tanks that crawled across the reef. The M4 Sherman was not the most powerful tank of the war. German Panthers and Tigers dwarfed it in armor and gun size. But the Shermans that landed on Betio carried something just as valuable: radios that linked armor and infantry in real time. Each Sherman's 75mm gun could obliterate pillboxes that had resisted naval shells. Their machine guns swept trenches clean. But it was the coordination, the infantry signaling where fire was needed, the tank commanders responding instantly, that made them terrifying. The Japanese, expecting isolated enemies, found themselves under the combined weight of infantry and armor, acting as one. Yet even the tanks faced challenges. The reefs trapped many landing craft, forcing Shermans to crawl directly off their boats into surf that reached their turrets. Saltwater shorted electrical systems, bogged engines, and drowned many before they reached the beach. Those that survived became rolling fortresses for Marines, magnets of enemy fire but also pillars of attack. Japanese gunners focused their artillery on these machines, but even when tanks were lost, their mere presence bought infantry the moments needed to advance. Then there were the flamethrowers. The M2 flamethrower, a heavy device strapped to the back of Marines, carried just enough fuel for about 10 bursts of liquid fire. Each burst lasted only a few seconds, yet those seconds turned bunkers into tombs. Japanese soldiers who had survived hours of shelling found themselves roasted alive, their impregnable strongholds undone by jets of fire. To the defenders, the sight of flames shooting into their sanctuaries was more terrifying than any shell. Flamethrower teams became priority targets, often killed quickly, but by then their work was done. Entire defensive networks collapsed when one or two key bunkers were burned out. Naval technology, too, played its part. Offshore, the U.S. Pacific Fleet loomed with battleships, cruisers, and destroyers bristling with guns. The USS Maryland, USS Colorado, USS Indianapolis, giants of steel, hurled shells larger than a man into Betio. Each naval gun fired with thunder that shook the very ocean. Yet the true power came when forward observers linked ships to Marines via radio. Fire missions could be called in on demand. A bunker that resisted direct infantry assault was erased minutes later by a destroyer's guns, guided with frightening accuracy. This responsiveness was alien to the Japanese, who relied on pre-planned barrages and could not match the Americans' flexibility. Even the landing craft themselves represented a technical marvel. The Higgins boat, or LCVP, Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel, looked unimpressive, a wooden craft with a flat bow and a drop-down ramp. Yet it was the vehicle that made amphibious warfare possible. Each could carry 36 men, charging directly onto a beach and disgorging its load in seconds. Without them, Marines would have been forced to row ashore under fire, or swim the distance burdened with gear. The Japanese dismissed them as fragile, and many were indeed shredded by artillery. But there were always more. Mass production in American shipyards meant Higgins boats arrived in waves, a ceaseless flow of men and equipment that turned Tarawa into a test not of individual machines, but of industrial might. The Japanese, by contrast, had fortified their island with weapons rooted in an older doctrine. Their 8-inch naval guns, salvaged from obsolete cruisers, could shatter landing craft but were vulnerable to naval counter-battery fire. Their pillboxes, while brilliantly constructed, lacked ventilation, turning into ovens under flamethrower attack. Their rifles and light machine guns, deadly in close quarters, were outmatched by the coordination of American combined arms. Their radios, scarce and fragile, left units cut off once leaders were killed. In many ways, Betio was not just a clash of armies, it was a collision of eras. Behind every piece of American technology stood an army of workers back home. In Detroit, assembly lines that once built cars now produced tanks. In Chicago and New York, Motorola and RCA manufactured radios by the thousands, each one destined for a Marine's back. In small towns across the Midwest, women riveted steel plates, tested circuits, and packed crates. The battle for Tarawa was fought not only by the men on its beaches, but by the unseen millions who had built the tools they carried. For the Japanese garrison, cut off on their coral island, such scale was unimaginable. Their empire lacked the industrial depth of the United States. Where America could replace tanks, radios, and men, Japan's losses were permanent. Every Sherman that crawled ashore, every radio call that summoned naval fire, every Higgins boat that landed another squad, all of it spoke of an enemy that could project power across oceans in a way Japan could never match. On Betio, this disparity became lethal. Technology amplified American determination. Radios stitched squads into units, units into battalions, battalions into an unstoppable machine. Tanks cracked fortifications once thought untouchable. Flamethrowers turned bunkers into infernos. Naval guns erased defenses that hours of marine assaults had failed to breach. The Japanese were brave, disciplined, and willing to die. But against the fusion of technology, doctrine, and mass production, bravery alone was not enough. As night fell over Tarawa and the wreckage of battle glowed with fires still burning, it became clear that the war had shifted. The Americans were not only willing to fight, they were armed with tools that made their fight devastatingly effective. The Japanese defenders, huddled in their remaining strongholds, realized they were facing not just Marines with rifles, but an entire industrialized war machine condensed into a single, relentless assault. By late 1942, the war had reached a critical stage. Adolf Hitler's armies had swept across Europe, but in the East they now faced their greatest challenge, the Soviet Union's unbreakable will at Stalingrad. This battle would become the turning point of the entire war, a clash not just of armies but of ideologies, endurance, and raw human survival. The city of Stalingrad stretched along the Volga River, an industrial hub producing tractors, tanks, and weapons. For Hitler, it was more than a strategic objective. Taking a city named after Joseph Stalin would be a symbolic humiliation for the Soviet leader. For the Soviets, it was a matter of national pride, Stalin himself declared, "Not a step back." German Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus led the Sixth Army into the city in the summer of 1942. At first, the Wehrmacht advanced with terrifying speed. Bombers flattened whole districts, turning streets into smoking ruins. But those very ruins became the defenders' greatest weapon. Soviet soldiers hid in shattered factories, basements, and rubble piles, launching ambushes at point-blank range. This brutal fighting was called Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. Every street, every building, every room was contested. Snipers lurked in the shadows. Grenades bounced through broken windows. Entire days of bloodshed could pass with the front line moving only a few yards. Amid the chaos, ordinary civilians still endured. Women melted down pots and pans for metal. Children carried water under shell fire. Families lived underground, listening to the endless roar above. Hunger and cold became as deadly as bullets. Yet the spirit of resistance only grew stronger. One name rose above the rest: Vasily Zaitsev, a Soviet sniper who became a legend. From the ruins, he hunted German officers, spreading fear across the ranks. His story inspired countless others to fight with the same determination. As winter descended, the balance began to shift. Temperatures plunged to 30 degrees C. German soldiers, still dressed for summer, froze in their trenches. Supplies ran thin. Ammunition, food, and medicine could not keep up with the demand. The once mighty Wehrmacht began to falter. On November 19, 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus. In a massive counterattack, they didn't strike the Germans in the city itself, but encircled them from the flanks, targeting the weaker Romanian and Italian divisions guarding the sides. Within days, Paulus's entire Sixth Army, over 300,000 men, was trapped in a steel ring. Hitler ordered Paulus to hold the city at all costs. The Luftwaffe tried to resupply the army by air, but the effort collapsed under Soviet fire. Hunger spread like a plague. Soldiers ate horses, then rats, then leather belts. Entire units froze to death in the snow. In January 1943, the Soviet Red Army crushed what was left of the German resistance. On January 31st, Paulus surrendered with 91,000 survivors, emaciated, frostbitten, broken. It was the first time a German field marshal had ever been captured alive. Out of the 300,000 who entered Stalingrad, only a fraction ever returned home. The world saw Stalingrad as a miracle of resistance. It shattered the myth of German invincibility. The Allies now believed victory was possible. And for the Soviets, it was proof that even the fiercest storm could be endured. But the cost was unimaginable. Nearly 2 million soldiers and civilians were killed, wounded, or missing in the 6 months of fighting. The city itself was a graveyard of ash and steel. Yet from its ruins, hope for the Allied cause was reborn. The Battle of Stalingrad was not just a turning point in the Second World War, it was the moment the tide began to turn against Nazi Germany. From this frozen hell, the Red Army would begin its long, bloody push westward, all the way to Berlin. By 1944, the Allies had prepared for their most daring gamble of the war, the invasion of Nazi-occupied Western Europe. The world knew that to defeat Hitler, they had to break through the Atlantic Wall and open a Western front. That day came on June 6, 1944, a date forever remembered as D-Day, the longest day in modern history. The plan was immense. Operation Overlord would be the largest amphibious invasion ever attempted. More than 156,000 troops, supported by thousands of ships, aircraft, and tanks, would storm the beaches of Normandy, France. The stakes could not have been higher. If the Allies failed, Hitler's Reich would remain entrenched in Europe. But if they succeeded, the liberation of the continent had begun. The night before, an armada of over 5,000 ships sailed across the English Channel. Above them, the skies roared with 13,000 aircraft, carrying paratroopers and dropping bombs on German positions. For the men on board, silence fell as the French coast drew closer. Many clutched photographs of loved ones. Some prayed. All knew the price that awaited them on the beaches. At dawn, the first waves of troops approached the shore. The beaches had been codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Each carried its own nightmare. At Utah Beach, American forces landed with relatively light resistance. Mislanded by currents, they found themselves a mile south of their intended target. Ironically, this mistake saved hundreds of lives. But at Omaha Beach, the story was different. The Germans had fortified the cliffs with bunkers, artillery, and machine gun nests. As the landing crafts lowered their ramps, men stepped into a storm of steel. Entire units were cut down before they reached the water's edge. Bodies floated in the surf. Equipment sank beneath the waves. For hours, chaos ruled Omaha, until small bands of survivors clawed their way up the cliffs, silencing German guns with grenades and bayonets. Their courage broke the defenses and turned what seemed like certain slaughter into a foothold for victory. Meanwhile, British and Canadian troops fought ferociously at Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches. Tanks known as funnies, designed by British engineer Percy Hobart, rolled ashore fitted with flamethrowers, bridges, and mine-sweeping gear. These strange machines cleared paths through minefields and barbed wire, saving countless lives. Above the beaches, paratroopers from the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions dropped behind enemy lines. Their mission: cut German reinforcements and secure bridges. Many landed miles off course, scattered in the dark French countryside. Yet despite confusion and heavy losses, these paratroopers sowed chaos behind German lines, disrupting communications and slowing the enemy's counterattacks. By nightfall, the Allies had secured a fragile but real foothold in Normandy. Over 10,000 Allied soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing in the first 24 hours. The beaches were littered with wreckage, bodies, and blood. Yet the gamble had paid off. Hitler's Atlantic Wall had been breached. Europe's liberation had begun. For the Germans, D-Day was a disaster wrapped in disbelief. Hitler had long believed the main invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the Channel. Even after the Normandy landings began, he delayed releasing his armored divisions, convinced the real attack was still to come. That hesitation gave the Allies the breathing space they needed, but the battle for Normandy was far from over. In the weeks that followed, the Allies pushed inland through the Bocage countryside, a maze of hedgerows that turned every field into a fortress. Progress was slow, bloody, and costly. German tanks, especially the fearsome Panthers and Tigers, exacted a heavy toll. Yet Allied superiority in men, machines, and above all air power slowly ground the enemy down. By late July, Operation Cobra shattered German defenses. American forces broke out of Normandy, surging into open country. The British and Canadians advanced from the north. The German 7th Army was encircled in the Falaise Pocket, where Allied bombers turned entire divisions into twisted wreckage of steel and bone. The victory in Normandy came at an enormous cost, nearly 425,000 total casualties on both sides. But its significance was undeniable. The Allies now had a firm foothold in Western Europe. Paris would be liberated within weeks. The road to Berlin was opening. D-Day was more than a military operation. It was a triumph of human will. Farmers, factory workers, students, and fathers from America, Britain, Canada, and beyond stormed ashore not for conquest, but for liberation. They fought to end tyranny, to restore freedom, and to ensure that Hitler's shadow would not consume the world. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, had told his men before the invasion, "The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you." On June 6, 1944, those words became reality. D-Day was not the end of the war, but it was the beginning of the end. From Normandy's blood-soaked beaches, the Allies would push east, chasing Hitler's armies across France into Belgium, and eventually into Germany itself. The longest day had passed, but the war's final act was drawing near. By the spring of 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing under the weight of its own delusions. From the east, the Red Army surged relentlessly, and from the west, Anglo-American forces pressed through Germany's shattered defenses. The once mighty Wehrmacht, stretched to the breaking point, was now a shadow of its former self. The war's final chapter would be written not in Normandy, not in the Ardennes, but in the heart of Hitler's empire, Berlin. The city that had once been the symbol of Nazi power was now a fortress under siege. Hitler's propaganda promised that Berlin would be defended to the last bullet, the last man. But reality was darker. Boys of the Hitler Youth were handed rifles too heavy for their shoulders. Old men of the Volkssturm, many in their 60s, were ordered to stand against Soviet tanks. Civilians dug trenches while artillery shells rained from the skies. On April 16, 1945, the Soviets unleashed the Battle of Berlin. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's First Belarusian Front and Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front led the assault. Nearly 2.5 million Soviet troops, supported by 6,000 tanks and 40,000 artillery pieces, advanced on the German capital. The scale was unprecedented. For the defenders, numbering fewer than 1 million, including Volkssturm and remnants of shattered divisions, it was a hopeless struggle. The Soviets bombarded Berlin with relentless fury. Entire neighborhoods collapsed into rubble. The night sky glowed red with firestorms. The thunder of Katyusha rocket launchers echoed like the voice of doom itself. Inside bunkers and cellars, civilians huddled in fear, listening as the city above them crumbled. German soldiers fought with desperation. SS units turned intersections into killing zones, mounting Panzerfaust ambushes against Soviet armor. Snipers roamed the ruined streets, turning every pile of debris into a fortress. Yet Soviet numbers and firepower were overwhelming. Block by block, house by house, the Red Army advanced, leaving nothing untouched. Deep beneath the Reich Chancellery and the Führer bunker, Adolf Hitler raged against reality. His empire was gone, his armies destroyed, his allies silent. Reports of entire divisions lost in days reached his ears, yet he demanded counterattacks from forces that no longer existed. Those who dared to speak truth were dismissed or condemned. In his final delusion, he still believed the Reich could rise again. By late April, the Soviets had encircled Berlin. Supplies dwindled, ammunition ran dry, and the city became a slaughterhouse. Soviet artillery fired nearly 2 million shells in the battle's final stages. Civilians starved, hospitals overflowed, and the dead lay unburied in the streets. Yet still, resistance continued. On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet troops stormed within blocks of the Reichstag, Hitler took his own life in the bunker. His body, alongside Eva Braun's, was carried to the garden above, doused in fuel and set ablaze. The man who had promised a 1,000-year Reich was reduced to ashes in a city of ruins. The fighting, however, raged on. On May 2nd, General Helmuth Weidling, commander of Berlin's defenses, surrendered the city to the Soviets. What remained of the German capital was a smoldering wasteland. Nearly 80,000 Soviet soldiers had been killed in the assault, alongside hundreds of thousands of Germans, soldiers and civilians alike. The cost of victory was staggering, but the symbol of Nazi power was gone forever. For the Allies in the West, the news spread quickly. The fall of Berlin meant the war in Europe was all but over. On May 7, 1945, Germany officially surrendered unconditionally at Reims. A day later, the guns of Europe finally fell silent. The fall of Berlin was more than the end of a city. It was the collapse of an ideology that had plunged the world into chaos. It was the reckoning for years of terror, genocide, and destruction. In the ruins of Berlin, the victors stood in silence, aware of the enormity of the moment. Yet victory carried with it a sobering lesson. The war had claimed over 70 million lives worldwide. Entire cities had been erased, nations scarred, and families torn apart. For soldiers who had stormed beaches, fought through forests, and endured the brutality of total war, Berlin was not a triumph to be celebrated, but a graveyard to be mourned. The war in Europe had ended where it had begun, with Germany in flames. The Reich that sought to dominate the world was gone, replaced by a divided Berlin, a divided Germany, and soon a divided world. The Cold War's shadow was already rising from the ashes. Still, the fall of Berlin remains one of history's most dramatic finales. It was the ultimate testament to endurance, sacrifice, and the human spirit's refusal to bow to tyranny. From the ruins of the German capital, a new Europe would emerge, scarred, cautious, but free from the darkness of Hitler's Reich. As the Soviet flag was raised above the Reichstag, one truth became clear. No empire built on terror can stand forever. The guns of Berlin had fallen silent, but their echo would shape the world for generations to come.